Thanks for having me here today, and good morning to everybody. My name is Mauro Tarbatti. I work for a company that is called Bpartners. It's a consulting company, and I specialize in working in turnaround and restructuring situation. So what I'm trying to bring here today to you, it's my experience in a topic that is quite hot around the world, and it's understanding and try to recognize early sign for financial difficulties of the company. Why understanding and recognizing those signs it's important? It's because based on those signs, being able to face and take action on them, it's of paramount importance to be able to actually turn around and restructure a company. In the kingdom, a lot of tools and infrastructure has been put in place so that the overall economic environment can enjoy healthy turnaround environment. I'll give you an example. A lot of effort has been put in place to allow easy access to financial data so that financial analysis can be a tool to predict financial difficulties and to face action as soon as possible. I would like to start by making a point. Usually when I talk about early sign of financial distress, a question is raised about whether it exists a formula that gives you as a result if the company will face or will not face financial difficulties. So to that question, I'd like to come back later in my presentation and share what I think is the status of the art about if there exists a formula to predict. I just want to say that if there would be a formula to predict financial distress, I would probably be using it, and I would probably be a very rich person. So, so where I would like to start from, we need to go the other direction. Okay, one back. Okay. One back. Okay. In our experience, companies faces periodically challenge period. So encountering financial difficulties is nothing particularly special. It's something that is embedded in the life cycle of every company. We like to segment the type of crisis in three different types of crisis: a strategic crisis, a profitability crisis, and a liquidity crisis. You can understand that in markets that are fast changing, with fast changing consumer tasted, pretty soon every company will face a strategic challenge, something that puts a company business into some kind of difficulties, in some kind of difficult situation. Sooner or later, this strategic challenge, if not addressed properly, will start hitting the P&L and will become a profitability challenge. The shortage of profit, sooner or later, will start hitting your cash flow, and that, pretty quickly will land into what we call a liquidity crisis. These three type of crises, they're different along three main dimensions. First of all, the crisis level. As you may understand, a strategic crisis usually is something where you have a lot of time to act on. Okay, it's a long-term challenge that the company has time to face and try to resolve. The second variable that they differ on, it's response time. As I was saying, if you have a strategic challenge, you have a lot of time, or you have quite some time to respond. As soon as you get a profitability challenge, the time shortens and the intensity of the crisis is increased. When you actually get to a liquidity crisis, basically the time of the company is running out. You need some severe intervention to try to fix the situation. The third variable by which these three different type of crises are different. It's the visibility, and this is the theme of this workshop. It's very hard for people outside of the company to foresee, to understand that the company is facing a strategic challenge. You need to be inside the company. You need to have a deep understanding of the business segment you're in to be able to understand that there is a strategic challenge. When you get to the level of a liquidity challenge, that basically everybody knows it, because liquidity, the lack of cash, is basically impacting the way the company interacts with all the stakeholders. So, as I said, these three main variables and why they are important. Response time, because it's understand how much time there is to fix the situation. And usually, the less time you have, the more severe action you need to take to fix the situation. The other important variable is visibility. We need to understand and recognize that different stakeholders have different visibility at every stage of the situation. Management, which has inside information, which is running the operation every day, probably has the best visibility of what is going on. Lenders, suppliers, unions, and external stakeholders probably suffer of what is called asymmetric information. They come very late into the process of discovering that something is wrong in the situation. It's important. Visibility. It's important because being able to understand early on that there is a crisis situation gives the company and all the stakeholders many more options to do something about it. As the company is running out of time, it has lost the trust of all his stakeholders, of all the lenders, of all the suppliers, of all the employees, then there is very limited time to do something. And sometimes there is no time to do anything. When the time runs out, okay, usually the only way that the company can save itself is to basically resetting the clock through an insolvency procedure. An insolvency procedure, it's a way to level the ground for all the stakeholders so that the clock is stopped, and at the same time there is an official procedure which provides the same kind of information to all the stakeholders. But when the company faces an insolvency procedure, basically means that there's no more time for the existing stakeholder, for the existing manager to do something. So, as we said, different type of crises, from the strategic, from the profitability to the liquidity, have a different set of information which make the crisis evident and readable to the external people. Strategic crisis, and we look at the end of my talk, we'll go through a real life case discussion so that we'll see more in concrete terms what I mean. But basically, a strategic crisis is seeable, can be seen in high-level information. It's basically is not got into the financial data yet, but it can be understood looking at market study, benchmarking the company performance compared to his peers, internal benchmarking, so how certain operational KPI evolved over time, degraded over time. Very specific operational KPI that are usually available only to insider. Okay, when the strategic crisis starts becoming lower sales, higher cost base, operational challenges that impact the P&L, then the sign of the crisis start becoming evident in the financial statements. Okay, so when it becomes profitability, then profit and loss statements and its evolution over time will start showing to the observer that there is something going on. Okay, balance sheet analysis. You will see that certain item in the balance sheet, and we'll discuss more what I mean here, will evolve in a negative way. So profitability crisis, it's the first step which start becoming more visible to the external stakeholders. I know here many of you are auditors, so are pretty much used at looking at financial statements, and that is basically, as an auditor, the first time where you get enough information to start, understanding there might be a problem in the company. When we talk about the strategic crisis, you should be able to look more at the operational data, understand more about the real business, and not only about the financial data. When it gets to the third stage, to the harder stage of a liquidity crisis, then the situation is pretty much apparent to everybody, because you will start seeing particular item on the balance sheet, because companies that are facing liquidity challenges, they would start raiding its balance sheet. You would start strange behavior in the working capital items. You will start looking at unusual usage of the credit lines. So basically, the liquidity crisis will become apparent in all the financial and cash flow statement, but also in the way that the company behaves with all the different external stakeholders. As a consequence of that, there is a different level of visibility of the crisis based on the different stakeholder, who you are as a stakeholder. And this is linked to the fact, as I said before, that a strategic crisis is visible in very internal type of information, and therefore only the management and maybe the shareholder, we have a full understanding of what is going on in the company at that time. When the crisis becomes a profitability issue, and the financial data will start reflecting that kind of difficulties, all the stakeholders that have access to the financial statements would start seeing some level of distress in those data. And it's the ability of those observers to be able to understand that those worsening of the data is actually a sign of something going on in the company, something not right in the company. And as I said, when I get to the liquidity crisis, basically everybody got an understanding that something is wrong in the company. Suppliers, they will start seeing their payment terms getting worse, so the company becomes a bad payer. Banks will start seeing that their revolving line are fully drawn, and the company is not able to reduce the usage of their credit lines. Customer will receive calls to try to get them to pay earlier so that the company is able to do cash. Also, company may start selling assets to try to raise cash and face the liquidity challenge. So the way, when it gets to a liquidity challenge, basically everybody interacting with the company has visibility of that. But as I said, when it gets to a liquidity challenge, very often it's too late to be able to have all the options available to resolve the situation. A lot harder measures should be put in place to recover the situation as it gets to that stage. Okay. So, while it is the task of the management and of the board to recognize and address a strategic challenge, we need to recognize that all these three different challenges have very different possibility to be understood from the outside. The strategic challenge, it's like we said, it's likely to be identified by insider only, as it is unlikely to have immediate impact on the financial statements. Profitability crisis, on the other side, is still unlikely that outsiders may have a early on understanding of it, but it start becoming apparent on the P&L and on the balance sheet as certain one-off measures are put in place. The role of one of the main stakeholders in any company is the board of directors. So it is interesting to address what should be the role of the board of directors. Also because, as I said, many of you that are auditors are actually interacting with the board of directors and have the role to make sure that the board of directors is actually taking action and understanding the situation. So it's very important for the board of directors to be able to appreciate early warnings and take corrective action. The role of the board of directors is to understand as fast as they can that there is an issue and to act on it. As we said, when the crisis becomes a deep profitability crisis and a liquidity crisis, it becomes apparent to all the other stakeholders. For example, the lenders. Again, it's very important that as the lenders start getting a hunch that something is not right in the company, if they have the tool to force the company to take action, to try to fix their business, they should pay attention to those signs and try to encourage the company to take action and try to solve the situation. Lenders have information because they may have in their loan documentation information covenants, they may have performance covenants, so they may have access early on to measures of the performance of the company that can allow them to understand the situation and to ask the company to act on. So let's look at what could be the role of the of the board of directors and what are the common themes in their role. If we can switch to, okay. So the first question is why it's important for the directors to recognize the signs of the crisis. And basically because if things do not go as planned, there will be always an after the fact examination of what went wrong and what was the role of the director sitting on the board while the company was facing difficulties. And there will be always a challenge to the director to see whether they were actually sleeping behind the wheel and whether losses occurred under their watch that could have been avoided by taking action based on those early signs. I think that an important role of the auditors is to help those board of directors to face reality when something like a crisis happens in the company. But this is not to say that bankruptcy or insolvency or a deep crisis is the result of the derelict board. Most often, crises happen with directors running a company, and those directors are smart people. They're asking the right question. They understand their business. They're not afraid to challenge the management. But very often, what they fail to do is to take action early on. Okay, and so the role of all the different stakeholders is to make sure that the board is kept to be accountable for being pushed to do something when they see those signs of distress. So let me give you here some red flags to be paying attention if you ever sit on the board or have access to the board and advise the board on a situation. We like to separate into three main categories of red flags that we should be paying attention. One is operational and liquidity. One relates to the management, so to the people factor, and and one are external sign. Remember, this is the point of view of someone that has inside information of the company. So someone that is sitting on the board and has, in theory, full access to whatever is happening in the company. Okay, and that's why they're very much accountable for not taking action, because they could have if they had paying attention to those signs. So operational and liquidity, significant misses to the budget or to the plan that seems to be regular occurrences. Okay, so the company has a track record of coming out with budget or plans and never actually delivered them. Okay, this is usually a sign that something is wrong. Or on the other side, huge misses of budget and plans that are surprises with no real, event that justify that. The second operational and liquidity sign is that earnings are being reported. Okay, so you have a P&L that shows EBITDA, EBIT, net income, but the company is not able to generate cash. Okay, but the company is always starving for cash. It means that something is not right. It's either those profits somehow are not healthy profit. Okay, maybe their profit, the company generates profit, but they put profits in the inventory. There's something wrong in the working capital. Maybe they generate profit, but are not able to collect their receivable. So when there is a huge discrepancy between the economic performance and the cash generation performance, it means that something is not right in the business. The other suggestion that I have is that a board, a director, or an advisor to a director should never should never get used to losses. So if the company generates many consecutive periods of losses, then something is wrong. Okay, it's highly unlikely that tomorrow will be a nice day. It's okay if we are coming from many days of losses. So do not get used to losses. Companies should not make losses. Management, so the people factor. One sign that something is not right is that management explanation for poor results are vague. Plans are always very down the future, so in 2 or 3 years' time we'll be fine. That's the justification. But tomorrow, the delivery of results will always be poor. Management does not govern to a clear chain of responsibility. You start seeing there is not, you don't really understand who's responsible, who's accountable for what. Okay, you start seeing there is discussion between the CEO, the commercial part of the company, and the CFO. You see that the CFO is unable to establish a good working relationship with the CEO. The CFO leaves, and many CFO leaves. That usually means something is not right in the company. And also, if you happen to sit on the board or to assist discussion as a statutory auditors, for example, of board of directors, and you see a management that discourage active discussion during boards, where they basically pretend that the board just rubber stamp their decision without any challenge, without any discussion, that usually is not a good sign. Any board, any statutory auditor position should have enough time to run challenges, to run the due diligence on the decision that the company would like to take. And then there are external signs. The third category is the external sign. You have in regulated business, you have regulatory agencies start asking questions about certain behavior of the company or certain data of the company. The company capital structure and the ability of the company to go on the capital markets somehow is impaired or looks weak compared to its peers. Of course, if the company has traded security, either debt or stock, usually the market is pretty efficient in penalizing those company. The company will try to react saying that the market is not understanding their business and they are unjustly penalized, but usually it's a red flag that something is not right. I would say that it's not unusual for any company to have some of those signs. Any healthy company will have some of those problems in any time in his life. It's, no one is perfect. But in our experience, when a company shows more 3 or 4 of those signs, then it is something that you should be very much paying attention, because it means that there is something that is potentially dangerous for the company. So, how to react? Something that you may want to consider, because as we said, in reading a distress situation, a crisis situation, it's important to acknowledge, to understand the early signs, but they're not really useful if then no action is taken against those early signs. So if you're sitting in the board of directors, or if you happen to advise them, some things that you want to consider if you are smelling something bad in the company. So if you saw more than 3, 4 of those signs that we discussed before, you have deep insider knowledge of the company, this is what you want to consider. First of all, don't be afraid to change management. Okay, if you saw that there were problems in certain areas, maybe you need to change one or more position of management. Retain external consultant to study the problem. Okay, maybe you need a fresh view, a fresh understanding of the business, of the situation, of the strategic positioning of the company. And ask that this assessment by any consultant becomes an implementation plan that the management has to follow after it has been approved and discussed with the board. But when you hire consultants to do this kind of exercise and you are smelling that you may be in a crisis situation, make sure the situation is analyzed quickly. Okay, it's not the time for a comprehensive 6 months long strategic review of the company. There's nothing that cannot be analyzed and understood in 6 to 8 weeks, or maybe even less, just to get an understanding of what the real situation is. Make sure that the board receives independent advice. Very often, many instances, this step is taken, but the usual long-term management consultant that advised the management many times in the past is brought in. They will say the things that I've always been saying. They will say likely what the management wants to hear, or at least they will have a very hard time to say something difficult that recognizes the situation. Also recognize the role of the auditors as the role of people that should check the financial statement, but they're not usually in the field of advising what to do in the future. They're not business consultant. Okay, so it's important to use the auditors to perform a role that it's in line with the role of the auditors, without pretending that the fact that the auditor says that financial statements are okay doesn't mean that the company may have decision to take in the future. The other suggestion I have is that it's very tempting for many directors in period of crisis to step in and take the role of management. This can be very dangerous, because usually creates distraction and breaks down the chain of command of the company. So boards need to quickly deal with the problem, but get back to their role, which is the role of governance and not the role of management. Very often you see in companies that are facing tough situation where the management goes back to the board for every decision, and basically the board is taking the management decision. This is not healthy. The board should challenge management, should pretend information, should analyze the decision that the management is taking, but should not manage the company. So we discussed here about the signs that insider, the red flags that insider should be paying attention to in a crisis situation. And we discussed about which kind of action, which kind of things could be done by insiders. Now I want to talk about what can actually be seen by a stakeholder that is not an insider, that is an external stakeholders. And the tools for external stakeholders to look for proxies as measure of the crisis is through financial analysis. Okay, that's when the company communicates with the external stakeholder. It usually communicates through financial statements and financial. Financial analysis means, you know better than me, to look at certain parameters in the financial statements that can be an indication of something going on, and you can start seeing also signs of a strategic challenge in the financial statements, but very often it's with the benefit of the hindsight that you're able to recognize that those were signs that meant something bad was happening in the position of the company. So, for example, company loses his competitive position, okay, gradually or through external shock. You would start seeing in the financial statements erosion of sales, slowing of growth, decrease in profitability, okay? And maybe by itself it's hard to see it's just, you know, the economy, it's just the overall environment or something specific for the company, and that's when you need to bring in, you know, comparables. You know, so you are able to see that slow growth, it's below what the benchmark of his peers are actually doing. So it means that the company is performing worse than his competitors. So something is wrong because it's not the market. My competitors are doing great. It's my performance compared to theirs that is actually not so good. Then you know, the second step is that certain signs can be seen about company performing below expectation and becoming attractive for investors. Measures like return on capital, erosion of equity. So you start seeing that the company is not able to increasing equity and distributing value, but is actually eroding the equity. As I said, rating agencies, if the company has rated securities, rating agency can actually decrease the rating of the security. So the company, the market, and certain parameters related to the market performance of the company are basically reflecting a lower performance of the company. Then when we said that when the crisis starts hitting the P&L and the P&L low performance becomes a lower sustainable, generates a lower sustainable cash flow, what can be seen on the financial data is that the company tried to make up for this lower operating capability to generate cash flow through one-offs. And then you start seeing unusual change in working capital items. The company starts stretching his supplier. The inventory has ups and downs that should not have in a regular kind of business. You start seeing asset sales, or more fancy financial transaction like asset sale and leaseback as a way to generate cash, giving away the operating assets of the company. You should start seeing also that the company very often when a company starts facing a strategic challenge and they fail to recognize that they're very late at taking action on their cost structure. I used to work for a company, was a large Chapter 11 in the US, was Eastman Kodak, the camera company. They faced a strategic challenge by the digital technology. They made a lot of profit with the film, making old style photographs. Now the digital technology came in and they faced that. So they see it coming. They took very aggressive strategic step to move out of the film business and diversifying into the digital stuff. But they were not able to do it fast enough, and they failed to recognize that they also had to take on significant cost-cutting measure to reduce their overheads. They used to be a very successful, very healthy company with a large workforce, with very nice benefits, with huge R&D facility. As the profit crisis hit them, they could not afford that anymore. And the failure to tackle that overhead cost structure costed them quite nicely, forcing them at a certain point to restructure themselves into insolvency procedure. Expensive financing. When the company is not able to show good financial ratio to the market, to the lenders, usually the lenders are not willing to lend those company new money on favorable term. And then is when you start seeing fancy lending facility appearing on the balance sheet, high yield, high interest, paid in kind type of security that a healthy company will not try to raise because they are too expensive, but an unhealthy company, a company facing a challenge, for them that will be the only way to raise new money and push the liquidity squeeze farther down the future. And of course, as I said, you should pay attention to all the working capital measure. Company that are facing profitability challenge that hit their cash flow generation capability, they will start squeezing or trying to make money out of their working capital. So they will reduce their inventory. They will try to do something to collect from creditor as fast as they can, or use facility where they actually sell their credits to someone else. They will start slowing down the way they pay suppliers, and so you will see as an increase of accounts payable on their balance sheet. Okay, so the next, so now I try to get, so we discussed about that for external stakeholder, financial analysis is the main tool to try to understand what's going on in the company. And financial analysis has gone through quite an evolution of analytical approaches in these late years. So I try to answer now, to tackle now the question of there is a formula that puts together all this financial data, financial ratio, that tells if there is if actually there is a crisis situation or not. And I also like to address the level of automation, so the level of how this can be, this financial analysis can be automated. So it all started many years ago with the classical financial ratio analysis. So you would identify the financial ratio that you want to look at. Then there will be human analysis in taking a look at how those financial ratios evolved over time, and they will try to make sense about what they mean in the situation of the company. Back in the 80s, then more statistical, more rigorous approaches like statistical analysis was introduced to look at those financial data. Basically using models like multilinear regression that would try to find which of those ratios were actually the most significant to be able to predict the crisis. One famous measure is what is called the Altman Z-score. Professor Altman is an American professor. They came up with this score. This measure is based on 5 indexes. Okay, they put together and they give you a score. If it's above 2.5, the company is healthy. It's below 1, the company is facing a crisis situation. So it's a very powerful tool, but it's also very imprecise because it is limited to 5 ratio. So maybe those 5 ratios are statistically very significant on average, but not in specific cases. They're fixed, so the weight of those ratios in this formula is fixed, and they do not recognize the fact that things change over time. So if you run those regression on data back in the 80s, today they're probably not good anymore. So what happened? As the computational power available to any of us became a lot bigger, what are called advanced analytics tools were brought in. We're talking about machine learning approach, which means that you can integrate and use a lot more data. You don't have to limit yourself to 5 ratio, but you can test many ratios and let the algorithm to learn which of those ratios are more significant. And as you feed new data to this model, the algorithm adjusts and understands that maybe what was an important measure 20 years ago, it's not an important measure anymore. And it also gives you the possibility to integrate heterogeneous data source, not only numerical data sources. Like, for example, it allows to use parameters like sector, country, region, that may require different, for which different parameters may be more or less significant. And I'll give you an example. Of what we have developed and we use in-house. So as we are a consulting company trying to advise company facing distress, we like to know in advance which could be our customers and which could be the companies that are facing distress. So we develop a machine learning model that basically collects all public available information. I don't know if you are familiar with, but we are using data from Capital IQ. Basically, Capital IQ is a platform from Standard & Poor's that collects all the data from companies that have publicly traded security, that have security on the market. Something very similar could be done here in Saudi, for example, using the data that Ahmeye is collecting from all the companies that operate in the kingdom. It's a machine learning model. I'm not gonna go into the details of the algorithm, but what is very powerful is that it has been trained on historical data, and every quarter gets a refresh from the new data and adjusts this algorithm. It adjusts the parameters it's looking at and try to predict what could be the company that are facing distress. Our target is to be able to signal companies that then may face some kind of default in the next 3 quarters, in the following 3 quarters. So the way it works is that we collect fields from Capital IQ, and as I said, this could be done from any financial data repository that you may have access to. These are the variables that are collected. They are transformed in indices so that they're not weighted for the size of the company. They're neutral to the size of the company. Then trends of indexes also become a variable. So if we are looking at debt to equity ratio, we also index how this debt has evolved over time, and that becomes a variable. So that if a company has had a deterioration in that ratio for a certain number of quarters, that becomes a variable into the into the model. So as you see, it's the sector, P&Ls items, average working capital measures like DSO, DPO, days of inventories, and then all the ratio that you can expect about sales over assets, return on assets, return on equity, total earnings. So all kind of financial variable that are used to see in any kind of financial analysis exercise. We consider overall 85 variables. So you can see how from those 5 that were used by the Z-score, now you have a lot more variables available. Our model shows that basically anyhow 25 variables are enough to explain 85% of the explanatory power of the predictive power of the model. If you are wondering what is the most important item up at the top, it's basically total equity over total liabilities. So that's the parameters that do. But reality is that you need all the 25 parameters to be able to do. You have on the right side of the screen, you have on your left side of the screen, you have basically the variables ranked by explanatory power, and below the distribution where it shows that basically with 25 you get 100% of the power. So the model has a front end. Basically, it ranks the company by a score of risk of default. It's not a probability, it's just a score. So if it is a score above a certain threshold, it means that it's worth paying attention. Okay, it's not error-free, so it may have false positive. It requires human to then take a look at the situation and try to understand if that company is just in a particular situation or is actually facing a crisis. And it allows you to drill down and see all the ratios, all the parameters, all the financial data to try to analyze quickly the situation. In this chart, a company called USEC is signaled a risk at Q1 2014, and it actually defaulted 3 quarters later. I ran it on some of the Saudi data a few months ago. There's probably 180 companies, Saudi company that have data on Capital IQ, and you can get interesting result that are worth considering. So it means that it can, in principle, it can also work on Saudi companies. So if you don't have any question, as a last section of my talk, I'd like to walk you through a real case, which is an adaptation of a real situation. But I think it's useful to give you an example of what I meant about strategic crisis evolving into a profitability crisis, evolving into a liquidity crisis, and which kind of visibility and which kind of signs were available at that time to the different stakeholders. Of course, it's very easy doing, looking backwards. It's very hard to do it looking forward. So the case study is about what we call the book company. Book company was a very old family-owned chain of bookstores in Europe, Their positioning was to run bookstore in small towns, so they would not be in large town, but they were distributed in small town. And in this regional market, they were the largest chain, and they enjoyed a very healthy market share. They had 40% of the books, of the sales of books, outside of big time in this country. They generated 400 million sales, and they had an EBIT margin of 5%. As it was owned by a family, it was conservatively financed. They had bank debt provided by the local banks, so nothing fancy. And the family left all the profits in the company, so it was run really in a conservative way. Assume today is 2005, okay? As you may imagine, 2005 till nowadays, it has been a very interesting and challenging period for bookstores. You know, think about Amazon and the likes, and how that completely changed their business. So the first observation is that between 2005 and 2010, tastes in book change. Okay, what a consumer would go and buy in a bookstore changed from the years before. It was, of course, done slowly. It was something that is very easy for me now to say, but hard to read in the past. And they went from certain novels to buying a lot of celebrity biography, cookbooks. So really, it's just customer buying something else. And book company failed to react to this trend. And at the same time, customer begin to place order for books online. So let me explain you what it means. So if I'm a bookstore and I don't have the book that my consumer wants, I can still sell it to them. Just I order it from the publishing house, have the customer wait for a few days, and then deliver it to them. Okay, so you don't really see impact on my sales in the short term, but I'm not offering a very good service to my customer. Okay, so it's very hard for any external stakeholder to understand that dynamic. Should not, but it should something that management of a bookstore should actually observe. And this is even more important when my competitors are actually online. A bookstore is competing against Amazon because you go to a bookstore, you want to buy a book, and the book is immediately available. Okay, if you are willing and available to wait for a couple of days, then you probably buy it online. Okay, so failing to have the books that people want on stock available in the store was a big issue. So management noticed that the ratio of books requested to the books available in store dropped significantly, but they didn't really act on these things. They were busy at that time refurbishing the stores. Remember, usually business people, they usually love their business. Okay, so they really care, and they love the physical part of their business. So when you talk about a manager of a bookstore refurbishing and having a new fancy store, that is somehow emotionally his first priority. Okay, so that was a distraction for the management in that situation. Also, the founder, remember the visibility that the shareholders have, and the founder, that he knows the business very well. He realized that, but they were in denial. They said they have seen worse in the past and they think they would get better. So if we look at and I'm not gonna annoy you with this, but basically what I want to say is that we talk about this situation in the strategic crisis. You don't see it very much in the P&L. It's the situation. It's hardly readable from the sales. You know, you go sales from 2000 and sales from they grew, profitability stayed fine. Okay, so you don't really see anything in the P&L. But if you look at the operating KPI, like the one I said, share of bookshop sold, you see that it went down a little bit but stayed healthy. Where you really see the issue is that the ratio of book requested versus books in stock went down. It's this number here. Okay, this was a sign of the company not really following customer taste and consumer behavior. Okay, really hard for anyone to understand that that sign was actually going to lead to a situation. Mix. So we're now in we were in 2010. Between 2011 and 2013, the competitive pressure from online retailer like Amazon became more and more important. And now you start seeing the issue becoming apparently as sales start dropping, profits start decreasing, and those becomes apparent start becoming apparent in the P&L because operating profit takes a hit. As a result, the company in 2012 faced a lower cash generation, and so they decided to made up giving up cash discounts. So the way it works is that bookshop can get an extra discount and so then make a higher profit just paying cash to the publishing house. As they made a lot of investment to refurbish the shop, the profit were not growing that much. They decided that they could improve their cash generation by giving up those discounts. Okay, but as a result of that, their profit were hit even further. In 2012, as this profit deterioration started appearing on the P&L and started facing started appearing also in the cash flow in the way the company bankers decided to notice they noticed an unusual use of the credit lines, and they asked the company to provide a report on the status of their business. So the banks in that case actually did something correctly. They forced the company to analyze the situation. The mistake, the owners and the management were kind of shocked that the banks came back to them asking to perform such assessment of their business. They gave the mandate to the usual consultants that they employed at that time, which came back saying that that was basically temporary situation and that demand will pick up again. So they failed to understand that it was more like a structural issue that they needed to be tackled. So if you look at the financials, what happened to the financial in this situation? Now you start seeing that sales are slowing down. Okay, now you don't have any growth anymore. Sales are going down from a peak of 425 to 509. Okay, also gross profit goes down. Okay, a couple of percentage points, and that is the result of having given out the cash discounts. The real issue, though, is that, as you can see here, EBITDA goes down a lot more. Okay, and in this, the case was that the company failed, okay, to tackle the issue of growing overheads costs. So they refurbished shops, they hired people, and they failed. Management and the founding family didn't want to lay off people to reduce their cost base. So now pretty quickly you see a deterioration of EBIT, so that goes into the negative territory, and the EBITDA margin is slimmed down. Okay, The other interesting thing that it's worth mentioning is that, as you can see from they raised the share of bookshop their market share among bookshops. Okay, it meant that they were successful among the bookshop, but the bookshop sales as an overall was decreasing. So their overall share of book went down. It means that their competitors were not the other shops anymore. Now their competitors were someplace else. And it's very important, because if you fail to understand that you're measuring your performance against the wrong competitor in a changing market, you will fail to see that your performance is deteriorating. So as we said, now we are in a deep profitability crisis. Profitability starts hitting the cash flow generation, and the companies started doing certain things. They postpone all capital investments as a way to save cash. You could also see a big drop in fixed. Go back one. Back one. Back. Can you go back to the slides? Okay, you can see a big drop in the fixed assets, okay, which was the results of basically two things. Slow capital investments and a sales and leaseback transaction, okay. You also see something appearing in the liability side of the balance sheet, which is a new piece of debt, okay, which they raised 10 million euros high yield paid in kind facility, so they are not able to get money from their usual local banks. They need to go to hedge funds, to more aggressive investors that they lend. So that's another sign that the company is struggling to raise money and to generate cash. But we are not yet into a liquidity crisis. You see, the company still has revolver facility available. The company still has no overdraft. So we're still in a situation where the company has some room to breathe, although they stress the creditors. Okay, so they slow down the payment. As I said, they stop using cash discount to try to raise money, and as a consequence, that is reflected in the working capital of the working capital item in the accounts payable. So we get to 2015. It's a much hotter and longer summer. This is in the north of Europe, so people enjoying staying outside, and there's an event where a summer of low sales happen, putting pressure on the company performance. So if it was a healthy company in a healthy situation, it might have weathered the storm, but in this situation the company is already stressed, and this one-off low summer season really hurted the performance. Management took the decision of not paying a couple of invoices, okay, to basically save cash. They needed to pay people, they needed to do, and that immediately affected the suppliers and basically made the situation pretty visible to everybody. As I said, when a crisis becomes a liquidity crisis, that is, it affects the way the company interacts with everybody, and it becomes visible to everybody. In this case, also, a report was leaked to a local newspaper, some piece of document saying that the company was facing difficulties, and then the spiraling of debt started happening. The bank saw their overdraft line go so the revolver line going into overdraft, and the banks basically call the restructuring advisor saying, you need to go into that company and tell me a situation of what's going on. It's an important, so now the companies went into a liquidity crisis, meant it didn't really have enough cash to keep operating, okay? When you are in a liquidity crisis, to understand how much time do you have to do something and what can be done, how hard, how dangerous the situation, requires a level of information that goes beyond the sampling period of the financial statement. You need to be able to access information that are monthly cash forecast, weekly cash forecast. Okay, you need to take it to the next level to really understand what's going on. By the time you get to the next financial statements, the company could be already dead, or could tell you nothing. Okay, so now the level, when you are into a liquidity crisis, if you still want to understand what's going on, you need to basically go down to a much more higher level, to a higher level of details. So if you go to the next slide, which is okay, this is it. So now you start seeing the situation, right? At the end of 2014, we had 9.6. Then trade creditors, we go even higher, 10.4. Then we go 30th of September 2015 at 12. It means that we're reaching a level that is unsustainable. Pretty soon, supplier will stop supplying. You also see that now the company still has the high yield new financing in place, but has also used all the revolver facility. Okay, it means that has gone through all the liquidity available from the banks, and start having an overdraft. It means that even their bank accounts now, they are overdraft. So basically, this company now does not have any headroom to do anything anymore. If you weren't able to do anything before this situation, then when you get at this stage, there's nothing really you can do. Okay, pretty soon your supplier will stop supplying you. Your bank will provide no more money, and pretty soon you will not able to operate anymore. And in fact, in this situation, the company faced a very severe liquidity crisis, and they couldn't really meet their cash requirement, and they were forced to file for insolvency protection, basically stopping all the creditors to try to attack them and getting time to declare, to try to find a solution into a procedure, into a bankruptcy procedure. So this is basically the summary of what I tried to rush through. The book company went to the full cycle of a strategic crisis, to a profitability crisis, to a liquidity crisis. And as you can see, I tried to summarize here the key developments and what could be the signs that could have been read in this situation. It all started with our new competitors, the online distribution coming in, and a change in the customer, in the consumer taste. There was a failure in understanding what that means for the term health of the company. The company saw the sales decreasing, but did not make any significant cost-cutting effort. They used instead working capital measure to try to solve the cash flow in a temporary way, but that also caused a further deterioration of their ability to generate profit. Banks believed that there was a restructuring measure to be taken. They asked the company to address and hire an external consultant, but the company used the usual consultant, and basically which did not really bring to the table the energy to drive a change in the company. And the company kept reacting to the difficulties by way of one-off cash measures like reducing capex, selling and lease back assets, raising expensive new financing. But without solving the operational long-term issue, the positive effect of those one-off cash measures evaporated pretty soon, and the company was basically left with no headroom to do anything, because they basically used all those one-off. They depleted, they raided their balance sheet to try to temporarily solve the issue, but without really solving it, they actually had no more headroom, no more opportunity to do anything, and they had to fail, and they had to face an insolvency procedure in that case, and they actually ended up being liquidated. So this is basically hence my talk. I'm very happy to take any question, any curiosity you may have, or any point of discussion that you may have. Yes.
Talking about going concern analysis and indicator, how can we implement that to find out the crisis stage, and if there is anything can help me to manage the time that I need to overcome?
So the question was about going concern. So if I understand correctly, if there is the analysis of whether the company still has going concern as an indicator that the company may be facing or not a crisis, and how can I use that to do something about it? I think it's a very important point. From a financial analysis point of view, going concern, for a company to have going concern is based on observing certain financial data and financial situations. So making sure that the company still has enough equity, making sure that the company still have to use its credit lines and they're not to be called. So it is very important for anyone assessing to recognize and to use that as a challenge for the board and for the management to tackle those issues. When you actually get to the point where there could be the doubt that the company does not have going concern, usually it's pretty much down the line. It's pretty deep into the crisis situation. And very often, when you have when the company is challenged by someone like the auditor saying you do not have going concern, it's a pretty strong encouragement. It's a pretty strong push for the company to do something and to face reality. Okay, so it's very important. It's a very important test that the company should face to. So let me try to be more. So if a company is facing a going concern because it is over leveraged, okay, so there's too much debt and the debt it's not sustainable, then it's very important that the company faces a deleverage exercise. So faces its lender and trying to find a solution to the over leveraged situation. If it fails to do so, pretty soon that over leverage will become a liquidity situation, because the company will not be able to invest anymore. The company will not be able to pay. Okay, so failing the test of going concern because our over-leveraged situation is a signal that the company needs to do something. Otherwise, sooner or later, will become unable to operate. Okay. Yeah.
Is there anything that can help me to decide the needed time to overcome the situation?
So it very much depends if you have an operational problem or a financial problem. Okay, so as long as you're operational, okay, it's able to sustain itself, then you have a lot more time that if that is not the case. Okay, so if your operation are able to sustain themselves, then you have the time to basically find, sit down with your lender, sit down wherever the problem is and try to fix it. If your operations are actually burning through cash, then it is pretty much an assessment you have to make if that's something to be stopped immediately because you're destroying value, or if you can afford to burn through this cash, but at the same time changing the situation of the company. There's no. I think that if you are in a situation where you have the doubt of having a goal and your company is destroying value by the day, then the time that is left is actually zero. You need to stop the bleeding in one way or the other, to the extent that you need to think about using an insolvency procedure so that you're sure all your creditors are treated in the same way and you're not treating them unfairly. So the situation depends pretty much by the level of value destruction that you're in that situation. Also, depending very much if you don't have your going concern. Also, the fiduciary duty of the management and of the director changes. They should start running the company for the benefit of the creditors and not for the benefit of the shareholders anymore. So you need to make, certain things cannot be done anymore if you don't have going concern. Or in order to be able to do that, certain things should be done in a protected way, like using bankruptcy or stuff like that.
If you were the consultant working with the bookstore, will you advise them to go out of business? There is no solution in competing with Amazon.
There's no solution. There's no solution. Yeah, I mean, if you take yes, absolutely. So restructuring is basically an investment decision. Certain point, if a business is not sustainable anymore, then the advice should be that the business should be liquidated, or there should not be an investment in that business anymore. Take a look at take for example Blockbuster. The American chain renting DVDs and video cassette. There's no way that business can stay healthy and can be restructured. It has a strategic issue that will never be solved. In case of book stores chain, they will never disappear, but they would heavily need to adjust their business model, really reducing their cost base, really changing their business model to be able. So it will be a very painful exercise. All the retail sector in the US, but everywhere in the world, is going through this challenge because Amazon and internet and online sales are challenging. The model of keep opening retail stores does not work anymore. but we will always go to shops and to malls. So it's a matter of finding a sustainable business model for those guys. Maybe if I go back, so you told me you were interested in about timing, and I probably didn't really give you the answer. In my experience, you have to think it this way. If a company is facing a strategic challenge, you probably have in years, 1, 2 years to fix it, okay? 2 or 3 years to fix it. If a company faces a profitability challenge, then it's more like, 1 year, 2 years, 6 months, and then if you fail to act, okay, the company will start depleting all the reserves it has on the balance sheet, okay, and sooner or later the red flag of what you call the going concern will start appearing, okay. When you get to that going concern issue, usually it's also a liquidity crisis. It's also very close, okay, because if you don't have going concern, you will not have anyone lending to you. No one will want to trade to you. Then you probably have a few months to take action, okay? If you're not able to fix it, to turn it around in a few months, okay, you're not. So very, very small. In few months, it's very hard to do anything. So unless you're able to do some kind of in a few months, you're not gonna cut cost or change the business model or transform. You're either able to do something on the capital structure that allows you to give you some breathing room and then fix it, or you need to force that intervention on the capital structure through an insolvency procedure. Okay. Thank you very much then. Thank you.